Before we get into this almost episode, I need to give a shout out to my excellent brother-in-law, Walter. Walter has very generously become the newest patron for the show, and so as a patron, he gets this shout out, as well as early access to episodes and behind-the-scenes research that I'm diving into. For just $1 a month, you too can be like Walter and help me offset the production costs of this show, such as hosting fees and the cost to obtain research material. To become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/writteninbloodhistory. The following story is one of those freak and yet totally avoidable disasters, with perhaps just a little bit more attention to engineering limitations, a better man in charge, a tad more municipal oversight, and a bit more concern for the lives of the poor in Boston. This would have never become one of the most bizarre disaster stories in history. But, like a toddler touching a hot stove, sometimes mankind must burn itself before it learns a lesson. And even then, we don't always learn our lesson. If any of you have ever seen the movie Jumanji, the old Jumanji, you might remember when one of the characters turns to Robin Williams and says, "A little water never hurt anybody." To which Robin Williams says, "Yeah, but a lot could kill you." The same, as you will soon find out, applies to molasses in this almost episode that I call the Boston Molassacre. Quote, "First you kind of laugh at it, then you read about it, and it was just horrible." End quote. Mark Rousseau, civil engineer and professor. We've all heard stories about how fire codes came to be, terrible, avoidable events that killed a lot of people. It's an unfortunate evolution that the law follows the tragedy. What happened in northern Boston in 1919 also greatly affected building codes. It just wasn't a fire. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Purity Distilling Company, which was a subset of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, knew a change was about to sweep across America. The 18th Amendment, outlawing the manufacturing, shipping, and selling of alcohol, was building steam, and it seemed inevitable. And so there was a rush to manufacture as much alcohol-based products as possible in a few short years while they still would be allowed. On top of that, with a Great War on the horizon, there would be a military, industrial-sized glut for ethanol, distilled from molasses, that could be sold to dynamite and explosive manufacturers. They would need a place to store all of this molasses. Thus, in 1915, the Industrial Alcohol Company's treasurer, Arthur Gell, was tasked with overseeing the construction of a massive molasses holding tank. The tank was constructed in the Commercial Street neighborhood of northern Boston, primarily occupied by poor Italian immigrants. It was one of the busiest parts of Boston at the time, seeing imports and exports dropped off and picked up and distributed by rail at all hours of the day. The tank's proximity to the harbor and rail cars was paramount to the logistics of the Industrial Alcohol Company. The tank would be a place to store the huge amounts of molasses imported from Puerto Rico, which would then provide a constant supply to the company's ethanol plant down the road. In constructing this tank, no codes or plans needed to be submitted to a building department. No engineering schematic needed to be given a stamp of approval. No permits, no licenses, no OSHA. The tank was classified as a, quote, receptacle, not a building, and therefore not subject to, really, any oversight at all. Gell, who was not an engineer, pinched every penny, as a treasurer is wont to do. The only calculations were those involved with the bottom line of a transaction journal. The construction of the tank was in the end designed by accountants, and therefore only the thinnest of steel would suffice, and the shoddiest of rivets. The tank, upon its completion, stood 50 feet tall and was 90 feet in diameter. At a max capacity, it was built to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. You would think, before putting it into operation, that the Industrial Alcohol Company would want to test it for leaks by first filling it with water. But no, it was filled with molasses on the double. The engineering flaws and oversights were immediately evident. As the tank was filled, neighbors and tank workers heard eerie moans and groans coming from the depths of the sticky chamber. Leaks, too, were popping up everywhere, and it became a well-established convenience for the people living in the neighborhood that you needn't bother purchasing molasses. Just send your kids down the road with a few jars to fill up with breakfast syrup at the leaking tank. One day, a laborer brought shards of metal that had been breaking off of the tank to the treasurer, Arthur Gell, presenting him with clear evidence of a looming failure. He replied, quote, "I don't know what you want me to do. The tank still stands." End quote. It not only stood looming over the working-class neighborhoods for more than a few years now, but it had become an extremely profitable asset as World War I raged on. But Gell did decide that the obviously leaking tank was a bad look for the company, so he ordered the steel to be painted dark brown to hide the leaks. In early January of 1919, the temperature in the northern Boston neighborhood was frigid, in the single digits, and the ice-cold molasses sat in the tank at about 2/3 of its capacity. But the Industrial Alcohol Company was receiving a new shipment of 500,000 gallons of warm molasses fresh from the Caribbean. And as the warm and cold molasses mixed violently in the tank, a fermentation process began to produce gases that put extra stress on already under-engineered walls that were also now suffering from drastic hot and cool cycles. 7 days after the new shipment, on January 15th, the temperature in Boston shot back up to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Around lunchtime, a police patrolman, Frank McManus, was phoning into his station headquarters when he heard an odd series of noises that sounded like scraping and twisting metal. And looking towards the sounds, he then shouted through the phone back to his headquarters, quote, "Send all available rescue vehicles and personnel immediately. There is a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street." End quote. In an instant, the tank had finally failed, and 26 million pounds of sticky molasses was suddenly released. Other residents reported hearing a deep growling sound. Others said that they heard a clap of thunder, and still others heard what sounded like a machine gun going off. It was the rivets popping out of the steel siding. Now, at first, molasses might not seem like that much of a threat to an able-bodied person. It moves slow. Slow as molasses, right? Aerospace engineer Nicole Sharp studied this incident in Boston and concluded that despite the slow movement of the sticky substance, the sheer volume of a material that's 40% denser than water became propelled by gravity, something more like a mudslide. And her analysis confirms eyewitness accounts that said this tidal wave of sticky goo roared down the streets of northern Boston at a speed of 35 miles per hour. 2.3 million gallons of molasses moving at 35 miles per hour in a wave that crested at 25 feet high, 160 feet wide, and smothered the heavily crowded city streets. In just a few seconds, 2 entire city blocks were completely engulfed. At first, people were lifted off their feet or struck with debris by a massive, sweet-smelling wind blast that preceded the coming molasses onslaught. And when the wave hit, it blasted down walls and poured through windows, pulverizing everything it touched. People were literally crushed under the weight of the mass, either smothered on the floor where they fell dying of asphyxiation, or smashed up against a building wall with fractured skulls and crushed rib cages. An entire fire station was lifted off of its foundation. Other buildings simply crumbled under the force. A streetcar was thrown off of its rails, and another truck was thrown into the harbor. Little Anthony DeStasio, who was just a kid walking home from school with his sisters, was picked up in the wave, and he rode the crest of it, almost like he was surfing, until finally being slammed onto the ground while the molasses rolled over him. And with the sticky goo forced down his throat, he struggled to breathe, and he could hear his mother calling for him, but he couldn't respond. From lack of oxygen, Anthony finally passed out, but miraculously woke up minutes later with his relieved mother and sister staring down at him. The following is an excerpt from the Boston Globe's account of this event. Quote, "Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there a struggled form. Whether it was an animal or a human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mess, showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men, and women suffered likewise." End quote. Now, with 2 to 3 feet of molasses covering the city streets of Boston, the more familiar nature of the sticky stuff became deadly. With the goo cooling down, it began to harden up, and with people still stuck in it, too. The first responders on this day came from the Massachusetts Nautical School, whose 116 students were aboard the USS Nantucket in the Boston Harbor. They ran to the scene of the disaster into knee-deep molasses to pull out any survivors they could find. Soon, the Boston police, The Red Cross, the Army, and the Navy were on the scene as well. It quickly became evident that because of the hardening molasses, that this was going to be a long-term rescue operation. Thus, surgeons set up makeshift hospitals on the scene to deal with the sheer number of wounded. For 4 days, people were continually pulled from the mess, and in the end, 150 people were injured and 21 people were dead, not including horses and all the other beasts of burden. And those who survived now had serious coughing fits to deal with. The dead were so encased with molasses that some weren't found for a while after. Even 4 months later, bodies are still washing up from the harbor. In the weeks following the disaster, the cleanup effort was immense. A fireboat in the harbor was used to blast salt water ashore to wash away what it could, and sand was thrown everywhere to absorb the substance. Even though molasses moves very slowly, it never really stops moving. As time went on, it snailed its way through streets and down stairways and into sewers and subways, and it was also tracked everywhere, into homes and businesses, telephone handsets and handrails. Everything in Boston was sticky for a long time. For years after this incident, the constant smell of molasses was an iconic part of living in northern Boston. Even today, it's rumored that on a hot summer day, you can still catch a whiff of the residue of this disaster over 100 years ago. The legal ramifications from this event were huge. Residents from the poor Italian neighborhoods of northern Boston brought about a class action lawsuit against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. And this was significant because prior to this, class action suits against corporate giants were still very rare. The company initially claimed an anarchist had blown up the tank, but under the scrutiny of courtroom testimony, the negligence became apparent. And in the end, adjusted for inflation, the company was ordered to pay out nearly $10 million to the victims of the disaster. From then on, corporate regulations and oversight were thrust into the public discussion, and more standardized construction codes soon followed. Stephen Puleo, author of Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, has said that, quote, "Every building construction standard that we sort of take for granted today comes about because of the molasses flood." I hope you enjoyed this almost episode. It's one I've had on the schedule for quite a while now. It's just such a crazy event that I don't think really exists in the public consciousness anymore. If you find my show worthy of a rating or review, please go ahead and leave one wherever you listen. They really assist me in organic listenership and help me grow the show. If you want to get a hold of me, you can reach me at steven.dejulius@gmail.com, or on Twitter, my handle is @sdejulius, or send me a message on the Written in Blood History Facebook page. And until next time, thank you so much for listening to Written in Blood History. See you later.